The first light of dawn painted the sky with soft hues of pink and gold, casting a gentle glow over the ancient city nestled by the Aegean Sea. In a modest stone house, a child was born to a family of humble origins. Her parents named her Calidora, a name that whispered of beauty and grace. From the moment she took her first breath, there was something ethereal about her, something that set her apart from the other children in the village. As she grew, it became clear that Calidora was different. While other children played in the sun-drenched fields, chasing butterflies and laughing in the breeze, Calidora was often found near the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom. The villagers would watch her with quiet awe as she sat on the temple steps, her wide eyes fixed on the grand statue of the goddess. Even at a young age, there was a serenity about her, a quiet reverence that belied her years. The priests and priestesses of the temple noticed her too, their whispers of admiration carrying through the sacred halls. Calidora's family was poor, but they were devout. They saw her fascination with the temple as a blessing, a sign that the gods had touched their daughter. When she turned 7, they made a decision that would change her life forever. They brought her to the temple and offered her to the service of Athena. The priests accepted her with open arms, seeing in her the potential for greatness, the kind that only the truly devoted could achieve. Life in the temple was not easy for a child. The days were long, filled with rituals, prayers, and lessons in the sacred texts. But Calidora embraced it all with a passion that astonished those around her. While others might have found the duties tiring or monotonous, she found solace in the ancient hymns, comfort in the flickering candlelight of the altar. She would rise before the sun, her small hands carefully cleaning the temple floors, arranging offerings, and tending to the sacred flames. And when the evening fell, she would sit in the shadow of Athena's statue, reciting prayers until her voice grew hoarse. As the years passed, Calidora grew into a young woman, her beauty only matched by her unwavering faith. Her dedication did not go unnoticed. The high priestess, a wise and elderly woman who had served the temple for decades, took her under her wing. She taught Calidora the deeper mysteries of the divine, the sacred rituals that only the most devout could perform. Calidora absorbed it all, her heart and soul becoming ever more entwined with the goddess she served. There was a stillness in her presence, a quiet strength that drew others to her. The villagers began to speak of her in hushed tones, telling tales of the girl who had given her life to the gods. They would bring their troubles to her, seeking her counsel, her prayers, and though she was still young, Calidora would listen with a compassion that belied her years. Her voice, soft and calm, would soothe their worries, and her prayers seemed to carry an extra weight, as if the gods themselves listened more closely when she spoke. But it wasn't just her devotion that set her apart, it was her purity of heart. In a world where even the devout could be swayed by pride or ambition, Calidora remained humble, her thoughts always on her duties and the well-being of others. She sought no recognition, no praise. Her only desire was to serve the goddess and fulfill her role in the temple. The high priestess saw in her a reflection of the sacred ideals they all aspired to. She began to entrust Calidora with more responsibilities, tasks that were usually reserved for those much older and more experienced. Calidora would lead the morning prayers, her voice ringing out clear and true in the temple halls. She was given the honor of preparing the sacred offerings, her hands steady and sure as she laid them before the statue of Athena. And when the high priestess grew too frail to perform the most demanding rituals, it was Calidora who stepped in, her heart pounding with the weight of the responsibility, yet never faltering. The other priestesses watched her with a mixture of admiration and awe. There was no jealousy among them, only a deep respect for the young woman who had given everything to the gods. They would often find her in the temple late at night, long after the last candle had been extinguished, her form silhouetted against the darkened statue as she prayed in silence. It was as if she belonged more to the divine than to the world of mortals, a vessel of purity and faith. But with her growing responsibilities came the growing burden of her role. Calidora was not oblivious to the weight she carried, nor to the expectations placed upon her. She felt it in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night when all was dark and silent. The path she walked was not an easy one, and there were times when doubt would creep into her heart. She would wonder if she was truly worthy, if she could bear the weight of the sacred duties entrusted to her. But those moments were fleeting, quickly dispelled by her unwavering faith in Athena and her belief in the righteousness of her path. The villagers continued to seek her out, their respect for her only growing as the years passed. They would bring offerings to the temple, leaving them at her feet as they whispered their prayers. Calidora would accept them with grace, her heart full of gratitude for the trust they placed in her. She would take their offerings to the altar, her prayers a bridge between the mortal world and the divine. And yet, despite all the admiration and reverence, Calidora remained the same humble girl who had once sat on the temple steps, gazing up at the statue of Athena with wide-eyed wonder. Her life was the temple, her heart belonged to the goddess, and every breath she took was in service to the divine. The villagers spoke of her as if she were a living saint, a beacon of purity in a world full of darkness. But to Calidora, she was simply a servant, doing what she was called to do. There was a quiet beauty in her life, a simplicity that masked the deep and complex faith that drove her. Every morning, as the first light of dawn kissed the horizon, Calidora would rise, her heart full of devotion, her mind focused on the tasks ahead. She would walk the familiar path to the temple, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early hour. And as she knelt before the statue of Athena, her prayers would rise like the morning mist, soft and silent, carrying with them the hopes and fears of all those who looked to her for guidance. The temple was her world, a sacred space where the divine touched the earth, and Calidora was its beating heart. Her life, though simple, was full of meaning, every action a testament to her faith, every breath a prayer. The gods had chosen her, and in her heart, she knew she would serve them until her last breath, no matter the cost. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting a silver glow over the temple, bathing everything in a light that seemed almost otherworldly. Calidora, as was her habit, walked through the quiet courtyard, her steps soft against the stone floor. The air was cool, filled with the scent of night-blooming flowers, and all was still, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. She had finished her prayers for the night, yet something pulled at her, a strange feeling she couldn't quite name. It was as if the night itself was whispering to her, calling her to stay a little longer, to listen, to wait. And then, out of the shadows, he appeared. He stood at the edge of the courtyard, his form almost blending with the night. He was tall, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around him. As he stepped into the moonlight, his features became clear, strong and handsome, with eyes that gleamed with an intensity that made Calidora's heart skip a beat. She knew at once that he was no ordinary man, yet there was something achingly human about him, something that drew her in even as it filled her with a sense of dread. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted in the world. Calidora felt it deep within her, a tug at her very soul, as if fate itself had drawn her to this moment, to this man. She should have turned away, should have run back into the safety of the temple, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. He spoke her name, and it was as if the sound of it wrapped around her like a warm embrace, comforting yet terrifying in its familiarity. How did he know her name? Who was he? Questions swirled in her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to ask them. All she could do was stare into those eyes, eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe, eyes that promised both ecstasy and ruin. He stepped closer, and she could feel the heat radiating from him, a warmth that seeped into her very bones. His voice, when he spoke again, was smooth and rich, like honey, and it flowed over her, calming and stirring her all at once. He spoke of the gods, of the stars, of the fates that wove the threads of their lives, and Calidora found herself entranced, hanging on his every word. But as he spoke, something within her fought against the spell he seemed to be casting. She was a priestess, sworn to the service of Athena, bound by sacred vows that forbade her from such desires, such emotions. And yet, here she was, her heart betraying her, drawn to this stranger in a way she had never felt before. It was wrong, she knew it was wrong, but the pull was too strong, the connection too deep. Days turned into nights, and nights into days, yet Calidora found herself seeking him out, yearning for the moments when he would appear. Each time they met, the bond between them grew stronger, and with it, the guilt gnawed at her soul. She prayed for strength, for clarity, for the will to resist the temptation that now filled her every thought, but her prayers felt hollow, unanswered. The gods, it seemed, were silent. As their meetings became more frequent, Calidora learned that he was no mortal man, but a god in disguise, drawn to her purity and devotion. He spoke of love, a love that transcended the boundaries of mortal and divine, a love that was written in the stars long before they were born. His words were intoxicating, filling her with a sense of purpose, of destiny, that she had never felt before. But with that love came fear, a deep, gnawing fear of the consequences, of the wrath of the gods, of the betrayal of her sacred vows. Yet, despite the fear, despite the guilt, Calidora could not turn away. Their love blossomed in the shadows, hidden from the eyes of the world, a secret that burned within her like a flame. Each stolen moment, each whispered word, was a mix of ecstasy and agony, of joy and despair. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, one that could lead to her ruin, but she could not stop herself. She was bound to him, heart and soul, and no amount of prayer or penance could change that. But the gods do not look kindly on those who break their vows, and it was only a matter of time before their love was discovered. One night, as they met in the temple's courtyard, a shadow fell over them, and Calidora's heart froze in her chest. The high priestess stood before them, her face a mask of anger and betrayal. Her eyes, usually filled with warmth and wisdom, were now cold and hard, as if made of stone. The god vanished into the night, leaving Calidora alone to face the wrath of the high priestess. The old woman's voice was harsh as she spoke of the sacred vows Calidora had broken, of the trust she had betrayed, of the gods she had angered. Calidora fell to her knees, her heart breaking as she pleaded for forgiveness, for mercy, but the high priestess would not be swayed. The bond between them, once so strong, was shattered, and Calidora could feel the weight of her sins pressing down on her, crushing her. The punishment was swift and merciless. Calidora was stripped of her robes, her status, her very identity. She was cast out of the temple, banished from the only life she had ever known. As she walked away from the temple, her heart heavy with sorrow, she could feel the eyes of the villagers on her, their whispers of pity and scorn filling her ears. She was no longer the revered priestess, the pure and devoted servant of the gods. She was an outcast, a sinner, a fallen woman. But it was not just the scorn of the villagers or the loss of her position that weighed on her. It was the knowledge that she had angered the gods, that she had broken the sacred vows that had once defined her very existence. She could feel the curse settling over her, a darkness that seeped into her soul, poisoning her from within. The love that had once brought her so much joy now felt like a chain around her neck, dragging her down into the depths of despair. Yet, even in her darkest moments, a part of her clung to the love she had shared with him. It was a love that had burned brightly, if only for a brief moment, a love that had made her feel more alive than she had ever felt before. But it was also a love that had destroyed her, a love that had turned her world to ashes. As Calidora walked away from the temple, the night air cold against her skin, she knew that her life would never be the same. The path she had once walked, so full of purpose and devotion, was now lost to her, and she was left to wander in the darkness, alone and cursed. The night was heavy with tension, as if the very air knew that something terrible was about to happen. Calidora sat in the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been careful, so careful, but deep down, she had always known that their love could not remain hidden forever. The whispers had started weeks ago, soft at first, just a murmur among the other priestesses, but they had grown louder, more insistent. Now, she could feel the weight of every gaze, the sting of every word spoken behind her back. The fear that had gnawed at her soul from the beginning had taken root, and it was about to bear its bitter fruit. The high priestess's voice shattered the silence, calling Calidora to the temple's inner sanctum. The other priestesses had already gathered, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and dread. They knew what was coming, and so did Calidora. Her legs trembled as she walked, each step echoing in the stillness of the night. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness pressing down, suffocating her. As she entered the inner sanctum, the torches flickered, casting long shadows that danced eerily on the walls. At the center of the room stood the High Priestess, her expression as cold and unforgiving as stone. Calidora's heart sank. There would be no mercy here, no forgiveness. The gods had been angered, and their wrath would be terrible. The High Priestess began to speak, her voice filled with the authority of the gods. She spoke of betrayal, of sacred vows broken, of the anger that now burned in the hearts of the deities they served. Calidora felt each word like a dagger to her heart. She had known this day would come, but the reality of it was so much worse than she had imagined. The love that had once filled her with such joy now felt like poison in her veins, a curse she could never escape. The moment of judgment was upon her, and Calidora felt the weight of the gods' gaze on her. She could almost feel their presence in the room, a cold, unyielding force that pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. The High Priestess raised her arms, her voice rising in a chant that echoed through the chamber, calling upon the gods to deliver their verdict. The other priestesses joined in, their voices a haunting melody that filled the air with a sense of doom. The room seemed to tremble, the very walls vibrating with the power of the gods. Calidora's knees buckled, and she fell to the cold stone floor, her heart pounding in terror. She could feel the curse descending upon her, a darkness that seeped into her soul, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. It was as if the very essence of her being was being torn apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but pain and despair. The curse was spoken, each word a hammer blow that shattered what was left of her hope. Her love had brought her to this, and now it would be the source of her eternal torment. The gods had decreed that she would be bound to the temple, forever cut off from the world she had once known. She would never know the touch of another, never feel the warmth of the sun on her skin, never taste the sweetness of freedom. She would be a ghost, a shadow, cursed to wander the temple for all eternity, her heart forever broken, her soul forever tormented. The curse did not stop at mere isolation. It twisted her very form, warping her body into a monstrous reflection of the love that had doomed her. Her once beautiful face became a mask of sorrow and despair, her eyes hollow and filled with an endless, aching loneliness. Her voice, once soft and soothing, now echoed through the halls of the temple as a mournful wail, a cry of pain that would never be silenced. She became a creature of the night, feared and reviled by all who saw her, a living reminder of the price of disobedience. But the worst part of the curse was the knowledge that she had brought it upon herself. Every moment of suffering, every pang of loneliness, every cry of despair was a result of her own choices. The love that had once seemed so pure, so beautiful, was now a twisted mockery of what it had once been. It had consumed her, destroyed her, and left her with nothing but an eternity of pain. As the final words of the curse were spoken, Calidora felt a cold wind sweep through the room, extinguishing the torches and plunging her into darkness. She was alone now, truly alone, cut off from everything she had ever known, condemned to an existence of endless torment. The gods had spoken, and their judgment was final. She wandered the temple, her steps slow and heavy, her heart filled with a sorrow so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. The other priestesses avoided her, their eyes filled with fear and pity, but she could not blame them. She was a monster now, a creature cursed by the gods, and they had every right to fear her. The once beautiful temple that had been her home was now her prison, its walls a constant reminder of the life she had lost. Time lost all meaning for Calidora. Days, weeks, years passed in a blur of darkness and despair. She could no longer remember the sound of laughter, the warmth of a smile, the joy of a simple touch. Her heart had turned to stone, her soul a hollow shell. The gods had taken everything from her, and she had nothing left to give. But even in her darkest moments, the memory of that forbidden love still burned within her, a small, flickering flame that refused to be extinguished. It was a cruel reminder of what she had lost, but also a testament to the power of the emotions that had once consumed her. She clung to that memory, even as it tore her apart, because it was all she had left. The curse had taken everything from her, her beauty, her freedom, her very humanity, but it could not take that memory. It was a small comfort, a bittersweet reminder of a love that had once been, but it was enough to keep her going, to keep her from completely losing herself to the darkness. The gods had cursed her to an eternity of suffering, but they had also left her with the one thing that could never be taken away, the memory of a love that had been worth everything, even the pain. The transformation began slowly, a creeping darkness that spread through her veins like poison. Calidora felt it first in her heart, a cold, aching emptiness that seemed to devour her from within. The curse that had been cast upon her was not just a punishment, it was a slow, agonizing death of everything that she had once been. Her beauty, once the pride of the temple, faded like the last light of a dying sun. Her skin grew pale, her eyes hollow, and her hair, once a golden crown, turned brittle and gray. The mirror, once a source of comfort, now reflected a stranger, a creature twisted by pain and sorrow, unrecognizable to even herself. As the days passed, the changes grew more pronounced. Her body, once graceful and strong, became frail, her limbs heavy as if burdened by an invisible weight. The curse gnawed at her, reshaping her in its image of torment. Her hands, once gentle, now shook uncontrollably, the fingers curling into claws that scraped against the stone walls of her prison. Her voice, once soft and melodic, turned hoarse and broken, barely more than a whisper in the cold, empty halls. The temple, which had once been her sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The other priestesses, who had once been like sisters to her, could not bear to look at her. They averted their eyes, their fear and pity a constant reminder of the monster she had become. Their whispers followed her wherever she went, soft murmurs of horror and sorrow that echoed in her mind long after they had faded away. Exile came swiftly, as if the temple itself could no longer bear her presence. The high priestess's voice, once filled with warmth, was now cold and distant as she ordered Calidora to leave. There was no anger in her words, only the finality of someone who knew that there was no place left for Calidora among the living. Her once sacred home, the place where she had dedicated her life to the gods, was now closed to her forever. The land outside the temple was as unforgiving as the curse itself. Calidora wandered, aimless and alone, through desolate fields and dark forests. The ground beneath her feet seemed to wither as she walked, the grass turning brown and brittle, the trees shedding their leaves in a mournful rain. The animals, sensing the curse that clung to her, fled at her approach, their cries of fear piercing the silence like arrows to her heart. The isolation was complete. No human voice called out to her, no hand reached out in comfort. She was alone in a world that had forgotten her, a ghost haunting the ruins of her former life. The nights were the worst, filled with the sounds of her own weeping, the cold wind whispering through the trees like the mocking laughter of the gods. The darkness pressed in on her, a suffocating presence that seemed to feed on her despair. The curse had not just changed her, it had spread, seeping into the land itself. The villagers who lived nearby began to notice the changes, the way the sky seemed to darken when she drew near, the way the crops failed to grow, the way sickness seemed to follow in her wake. They spoke of her in hushed tones, calling her the Cursed One, a harbinger of doom. Their fear turned to hatred, and they drove her further into the wilderness, casting stones and curses as they pushed her away. Her exile took her to the mountains, a place where even the gods seemed to have forgotten. The air was thin and cold, the ground barren, the sky a constant, unforgiving gray. It was a land that matched her soul, empty and desolate. Here, she found a cave, a dark, damp hole in the side of the mountain that became her new home. The walls were rough and cold, the floor hard and unforgiving, but it was a shelter from the relentless wind and the stares of those who would condemn her. The loneliness was her only companion. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, the curse held her in its grip. She could no longer remember what it felt like to be warm, to be loved, to be human. Her heart, once so full of life, was now a hollow, aching void. The pain was a constant presence, a dull throb that never left her, a reminder of the love that had brought her to this fate. But the curse did not just destroy her, it tainted everything around her. The mountain itself seemed to suffer, the rocks cracking and crumbling, the streams drying up, the very earth rejecting her presence. The few travelers who passed through the region spoke of the cursed mountain, a place where no light could penetrate, where no life could survive. They told tales of a creature that lived in the cave, a twisted, monstrous being that was neither alive nor dead, a shadow of what had once been human. The people of the villages spoke of her as a legend, a cautionary tale to frighten children into obedience. They said that to look upon her was to be cursed, that her gaze could turn a person to stone, that her touch could steal the very breath from your lungs. Her name became a byword for fear, her story a dark fable passed down through the generations. But Calidora was not the monster they imagined. She was still a woman, still capable of feeling, of suffering. The curse had taken her beauty, her life, her future, but it had not taken her soul. In the darkness of her cave, she wept for the life she had lost, for the love that had condemned her, for the pain that would never end. The tears carved paths down her hollow cheeks, a silent testament to the torment that had become her existence. The land continued to wither under the weight of the curse. The once fertile fields lay barren, the rivers ran dry, the sky a constant shroud of gray. The people grew desperate, their fear turning to anger, their anger to hatred. They prayed to the gods for deliverance, for the curse to be lifted, but the gods remained silent. The curse had been cast, and there was no escape, no redemption. Calidora's isolation was complete, her transformation final. She was no longer the priestess who had served the gods, no longer the woman who had loved and been loved in return. She was something else now, something born of pain and sorrow, a creature of darkness and despair. The world had turned its back on her, and she had turned her back on the world. But deep within her, buried beneath the layers of grief and torment, a small spark of defiance remained. The curse had taken everything from her, but it had not taken her will to survive. She was still alive, still fighting, even if that fight was a losing battle. The curse had isolated her, transformed her, but it had not destroyed her. Not yet. She had almost given up hope. Each day, the darkness inside Calidora grew heavier, threatening to crush whatever was left of her spirit. But deep within that abyss, a faint glimmer refused to die out. It whispered to her in the stillness of the night, urging her to rise once more. The curse had taken so much, but it hadn't completely extinguished her will to fight. She couldn't bear the weight of this torment any longer, nor could she stand the pain she brought to the world around her. The land, once lush and vibrant, had turned barren, a reflection of the despair that had taken root in her soul. She knew she had to try, even if the chance of success was slim, even if the gods had turned their backs on her. She had to seek redemption. Calidora began her quest with nothing but a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the gods would show mercy. The path before her was shrouded in uncertainty, but she knew she couldn't stay in the cave that had become her prison. She gathered what little strength remained in her frail body and set out, driven by the desperation to free herself from the curse that had shattered her life. The journey was grueling, each step a reminder of her weakened state, each breath a battle against the cold air that seemed to cling to her skin. But she pressed on, her determination fueled by the memories of a time before the curse, when she was whole, when she had something worth fighting for. Her feet carried her over desolate lands, where the soil was dry and cracked, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches barren and twisted. Days turned into nights, and the road seemed endless, but Calidora knew there was no turning back. She sought out the sacred places where the gods were known to dwell, places where she might find the answers she desperately needed. The first of these was a mountain temple, perched high above the clouds. It was said to be a place of immense power, where the gods could hear the pleas of those who were truly penitent. The climb was treacherous, the path narrow and steep, but Calidora forced herself to continue. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the curse that coursed through her veins. When she finally reached the temple, she fell to her knees before the altar, her voice a broken whisper as she begged for forgiveness. The cold stone beneath her hands felt as lifeless as the silence that surrounded her. The gods did not answer, and the weight of their absence crushed her spirit. But she couldn't stop now. There had to be another way, another chance to prove her remorse. Leaving the temple behind, Calidora journeyed deeper into the wilderness, where the lines between the mortal world and the divine were blurred. It was there, in the heart of a dark forest, that she encountered the first of the mythical beings who would test her resolve. The creature was unlike anything she had ever seen, a being of pure shadow, with eyes that glowed like embers in the night. It circled her, its presence suffocating, as if the very air had thickened around her. The creature spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It taunted her, reminding her of the sin that had brought the curse upon her, questioning her worthiness of redemption. The words cut deep, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. But Calidora, though weakened and afraid, refused to be swayed. She stood her ground, her voice trembling but determined as she declared her intention to seek forgiveness, no matter the cost. The creature laughed, a sound that sent shivers down her spine, but it did not attack. Instead, it disappeared into the shadows, leaving her to continue on her way. But the encounter had left its mark, and Calidora knew that her quest would be fraught with such challenges. The road to redemption would not be an easy one. As she traveled further, she came across a river that sparkled with an unnatural light, its waters impossibly clear. She knew this river from the stories told in the temple. It was said to be a place where the gods came to wash away their troubles, a sacred site that could grant purity to those who drank from it. But as she approached, a figure emerged from the water, a goddess draped in silver and moonlight. Her beauty was otherworldly, her presence both comforting and terrifying. The goddess regarded Calidora with a mixture of pity and disdain. She knew of the curse, of the forbidden love that had led to it, and she spoke of the consequences of such defiance. The words were not kind, but they were truthful, and they cut through the haze of Calidora's mind, forcing her to confront the gravity of her actions. The goddess offered her a choice, to drink from the river and wash away the pain, but at the cost of her memories, or to continue on her path, burdened by the full weight of her past. Calidora hesitated, the temptation to forget everything almost overwhelming. But in the end, she chose to keep her memories, no matter how painful. She knew that redemption could not be bought by forgetting, it had to be earned through suffering and sacrifice. The goddess nodded, a faint smile of approval on her lips, before disappearing into the mist that hung over the water. The river, though beautiful, offered no solace, and so Calidora pressed on. Her journey took her to the edge of the world, to a place where the sky met the sea, and the horizon seemed to stretch on into eternity. It was here that she met the last of the beings who would test her, the Titan Prometheus, bound to his rock, his body ravaged by the punishment inflicted upon him by the gods. His suffering was endless, yet his spirit remained unbroken, a testament to the power of defiance. Prometheus saw in Calidora a kindred spirit, someone who had been cast aside by the gods, but refused to surrender. He spoke to her of the price of defiance, of the pain that came with challenging the will of the divine, but he also spoke of hope. He told her that redemption was not something that could be granted by the gods, it was something that had to be earned through unwavering resolve and the willingness to bear the consequences of one's actions. His words resonated deep within Calidora, strengthening her resolve. She knew that the path she had chosen would not be easy, that the gods might never forgive her, but she also knew that she had to try. She had to prove that she was more than the sum of her mistakes, that she could rise above the curse that had been placed upon her. With renewed determination, Calidora continued her journey, the road ahead still uncertain, but her heart now filled with a fire that the curse could not extinguish. She knew that her quest for redemption was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe that there might be a way to break free from the darkness that had consumed her. The path would be long, and the challenges great, but she was ready to face them, no matter the cost. The path before her was treacherous, but Calidora had no choice but to walk it. Each step was a test, each breath a reminder of the curse that clung to her like a shadow. She knew the gods were watching, their gaze cold and unforgiving, as if daring her to falter. But Calidora refused to give in to despair. She had come too far, endured too much, to let her spirit break now. Yet, the road ahead was filled with trials that would push her to the edge of her endurance, threatening to snuff out the fragile hope that had kept her going. The first trial came when she reached a narrow pass in the mountains. The winds howled through the crags, sharp as knives, cutting through her thin robes and chilling her to the bone. The rocks beneath her feet were slick with ice, and one misstep would send her plunging into the abyss below. But it wasn't just the physical dangers that tested her here. As she made her way through the pass, the winds carried whispers, dark, insidious voices that gnawed at her resolve. They spoke of her failures, of the love that had led her to this cursed fate, of the futility of her quest. The voices grew louder, more relentless, until they were all she could hear, drowning out even the sound of her own thoughts. They told her she was weak, that she was a fool to think she could ever escape the wrath of the gods. Calidora's steps faltered, her knees buckling under the weight of the doubts that threatened to overwhelm her. But even as she stumbled, she gritted her teeth and forced herself to keep going. The pain in her heart was nothing compared to the regret she would feel if she gave up now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voices faded, leaving her in a silence that was almost deafening. She had passed the first trial, but it had taken its toll. Her heart was heavy, her body trembling with exhaustion. Still, she pressed on, knowing that this was only the beginning. The second trial was not one of the body, but of the soul. As she descended into a dark forest, the air grew thick and oppressive, filled with the scent of decay. The trees were ancient, their gnarled branches twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for her as she passed. The ground was soft and spongy, each step sinking into the earth as if it were trying to pull her under. But it was the silence that unnerved her the most, an unnatural stillness that pressed in on her from all sides. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Calidora's heart raced as she spun around, her eyes searching the shadows for the source of the sound. But there was nothing, only the trees, looming over her like silent sentinels. Another scream pierced the air, followed by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. It was coming closer, whatever it was, and Calidora could feel her pulse quicken with fear. But she couldn't run. Not this time. She had to stand her ground, no matter what came for her. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she faced the darkness, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The forest seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing thicker, until she could barely see her own hand in front of her face. Then, from the gloom, a figure emerged, half human, half beast, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was a creature of the underworld, sent to test her resolve, to see if she would falter in the face of fear. The beast lunged at her, its claws slashing through the air, but Calidora didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, but her gaze steady. The beast snarled, its breath hot and foul against her skin, but still, she didn't move. She had faced worse demons in her own heart, this was just another trial to be overcome. With a final, furious roar, the beast disappeared, leaving her alone in the darkness once more. Calidora's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, her body trembling with relief and exhaustion. But she had survived. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger for it. The final trial came when she was at her weakest, both physically and emotionally. She had wandered for days without food or water, her strength nearly spent. The sun beat down on her mercilessly as she crossed a barren wasteland, the heat rising in shimmering waves from the cracked earth. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust. Every part of her body screamed for rest, for relief from the torment that had become her existence. As she lay there, the ground burning her skin, she heard footsteps approaching. Her heart leapt with hope, perhaps someone had come to help her, to guide her to the end of this nightmare. But when she looked up, her hope died. It was Hermes, the messenger of the gods, his expression cold and unyielding. He told her that the gods had decreed this final trial, a test of her will to survive, even in the face of certain death. Hermes offered her a choice. She could end her suffering now, simply by closing her eyes and letting the darkness take her, or she could continue on, fighting against the odds, knowing that the path ahead would only grow harder. The choice was hers. Calidora's heart ached with the weight of the decision. She was so tired, so worn down by the trials she had faced. The thought of letting go, of finally finding peace, was so tempting. But then she thought of the curse, of the pain she had caused, and she knew she couldn't give up. Not yet. She couldn't let the gods win. With a strength she didn't know she had left, Calidora pushed herself to her feet. Her body was weak, her vision still blurred, but her resolve had never been stronger. She looked Hermes in the eye and told him she would continue. She would see this through to the end, no matter what it cost her. Hermes nodded, a faint smile of approval on his lips, and then he was gone. The wasteland stretched out before her, endless and unforgiving, but Calidora took the first step. She had survived the trials, but the true test was still ahead. The road to redemption was long and filled with pain, but she was ready. She would not be broken. She would not be defeated. Calidora had always believed her curse was a punishment, a cruel consequence of her forbidden love. It had twisted her body, exiled her from her people, and left her to wander the desolate lands. The weight of her guilt had been unbearable, a constant reminder of the price she paid for breaking sacred vows. But as she walked the barren paths, something began to change, a whisper, a stirring in the depths of her heart, telling her that there was more to her curse than she had ever imagined. The sky above was dark, thick with storm clouds that churned like restless spirits. She sought shelter in a cave nestled at the foot of a craggy mountain, its entrance barely visible behind a curtain of ivy. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls lined with ancient markings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet they tugged at something deep within her, as if they held secrets she was meant to uncover. As she traced the markings with trembling fingers, her heart began to race. The lines and curves spoke of a story older than time itself, written in the language of the gods. The cave was no ordinary refuge, it was a sacred place, a hidden shrine that had remained untouched for centuries. And it was here, in this forgotten sanctuary, that Calidora would learn the truth about her curse. The symbols revealed a prophecy, one that had been long buried beneath layers of myth and legend. It spoke of a priestess who would fall from grace, cursed by the gods for her transgressions. But it also spoke of something more, a hidden purpose, a destiny that had been woven into the very fabric of her being. The curse was not just a punishment, it was a key, a catalyst that would set in motion events far greater than herself. Calidora's heart pounded in her chest as the realization dawned on her. The gods had not cursed her out of spite or anger, they had cursed her because she was the one destined to fulfill an ancient prophecy. Her suffering had a purpose, one that had been hidden from her until now. The curse was meant to transform her, to break her down and rebuild her into something stronger, something that could withstand the trials that lay ahead. As the truth unfolded before her, memories she had long buried began to resurface. She remembered her childhood, the strange dreams that had haunted her since she was a child, dreams of gods and monsters, of battles fought in the heavens and prophecies whispered in the dark. She had always thought them to be nothing more than nightmares, but now she understood, they were visions, glimpses of a destiny she had been born to fulfill. Her parents had always told her she was special, chosen by the gods for a higher purpose. But they had never told her what that purpose was, and now, standing in the heart of the ancient shrine, she finally understood why. The truth had been too dangerous, too powerful to be revealed to a child. The gods had kept it hidden, waiting for the right moment, waiting for her to be ready. And now, she was ready. The curse that had once felt like a prison was now the key to her freedom. It had connected her to something far greater than herself, something that spanned the ages and reached deep into the core of existence. She was not just a victim of the gods' wrath, she was a part of their plan, an essential piece in the cosmic puzzle that held the fate of the world. As she pieced together the prophecy, Calidora felt a surge of power, a strength she had never known before. The curse that had once drained her of life now filled her with purpose. Her transformation, her suffering, had all been leading to this moment. The gods had shaped her, molded her into the warrior she needed to become. But the revelation also brought with it a terrible burden. The prophecy spoke of great sacrifice, of battles that would test her beyond anything she had ever faced. The curse was not just her burden to bear, it was her weapon, and she would need it in the coming war. The fate of the world rested on her shoulders, and the gods had chosen her to carry it. There was no time to dwell on the past, no time to grieve for the life she had lost. The future was calling, and it was filled with danger and uncertainty. But for the first time since the curse had been cast upon her, Calidora felt a sense of peace. She knew now that her suffering had a purpose, that she had been chosen for a reason. The gods had not abandoned her, they had prepared her for the battle to come. As she left the cave, the storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and bright. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and rain. The world seemed different, as if it too had been transformed by the revelation. Calidora took a deep breath, feeling the power of the curse coursing through her veins. She was no longer the broken priestess who had once wandered these lands. She was something more, something stronger. The path ahead was uncertain, but she no longer walked it in fear. The gods had shown her the truth, and she would not let them down. Her curse, her destiny, was now clear, and she would face whatever trials came her way with courage and determination. The world was waiting for her, and she would not fail. Calidora set off into the distance, her heart filled with a new sense of purpose. The gods had revealed the truth, and she would use it to carve her own path, to fulfill the prophecy that had been written in the stars long before she was born. The curse was no longer a burden, it was her strength, her weapon, and she would wield it with pride. And as she walked, the world around her seemed to pulse with life, as if it too recognized the change in her. The curse had not broken her, it had transformed her into the warrior she was always meant to be. And with that revelation, she knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The air was thick with tension, as if the world itself held its breath. Calidora stood at the edge of a darkened clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. Before her loomed the ancient temple, now decayed and crumbling, but still radiating an aura of power. This was the place where it all began, where she had first encountered the deity who cursed her. And now, she had returned to face the very force that had turned her life into a nightmare. The night was eerily quiet, the silence only broken by the distant rumble of thunder. She had come so far, endured so much, but now, standing on the threshold of the final confrontation, she felt the weight of fear pressing down on her. This was the moment she had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure, the moment when she would confront the deity who had twisted her fate. As she stepped into the clearing, the shadows seemed to close in around her, tightening like a noose. But she did not waver. She had been preparing for this, steeling her resolve with every step of her journey. The curse that had once weakened her now burned within her, a fierce flame that gave her strength. She would not be broken. From the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall and imposing, it moved with a grace that belied its immense power. The deity's presence was overwhelming, filling the air with a palpable energy that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was the same presence she had felt all those years ago, when she had first been marked by the curse. But this time, she was not the frightened priestess who had begged for mercy. She was a warrior, ready to fight for her redemption. The deity's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its voice, when it spoke, was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "You dare return," it said, its tone laced with both surprise and disdain. Calidora's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stand tall, meeting the deity's gaze with unwavering determination. "I have come to end this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. The deity's lips curled into a cold, cruel smile. "End this? You are nothing but a mortal, a fool who thought she could defy the will of the gods. You should have accepted your fate, priestess." A surge of anger welled up within her, fueled by the years of suffering she had endured. "My fate was twisted by your hand," she replied, her voice rising with emotion. "But I am no longer the woman you cursed. I have learned the truth. The curse was never meant to destroy me, it was meant to forge me into something stronger." The deity's expression darkened, and the air crackled with a sudden surge of power. "You presume to understand the will of the gods," it hissed, its voice filled with contempt. But Calidora did not flinch. She had faced her deepest fears, battled against overwhelming odds, and survived. She would not back down now. "I understand enough," she said, her voice firm. "I understand that I have a choice. I can either let this curse define me, or I can reclaim my destiny." The deity's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground beneath her feet, the deity launched itself at her, a blur of motion and raw power. Calidora barely had time to react, but instinct guided her movements. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the deity's outstretched hand, which slammed into the earth with enough force to send shockwaves through the clearing. This was no mere battle of wills, it was a fight for her very soul. The deity was relentless, its attacks coming faster and more furious with each passing moment. But Calidora fought back with everything she had, drawing on the strength she had gained throughout her journey. Each blow she landed, each strike she deflected, brought her closer to her goal. The battle raged on, a storm of violence and fury. The deity's power was overwhelming, but Calidora refused to yield. She could feel the curse pulsing within her, fueling her with a fierce determination. This was her fight, her chance to reclaim what had been taken from her. As they clashed, the air around them seemed to shimmer, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Calidora could feel the presence of the gods, watching from the shadows, their fates intertwined with her own. She was no longer just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been touched by the cruelty of the gods. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Calidora managed to land a blow that sent the deity reeling. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The deity staggered, its form flickering like a dying flame. And in that moment, Calidora saw something she had never expected: fear. The deity, the all-powerful being that had cursed her, was afraid. Not of her, but of what she represented. She was proof that even the gods could be challenged, that their power was not absolute. And in that moment, Calidora knew she had won. With a cry that echoed through the night, she channeled all her pain, all her anger, into one final strike. The blow landed with a force that shook the heavens, and the deity let out a scream that pierced the sky. The curse that had bound her for so long shattered like glass, and the deity's form dissolved into nothingness, leaving only silence in its wake. Calidora stood alone in the clearing, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The curse was gone, and with it, the weight that had burdened her for so long. She had faced the deity, fought with everything she had, and emerged victorious. The battle was over, but its impact would resonate through eternity. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, Calidora stood at the edge of the ancient temple, her body trembling with exhaustion. The battle was over, the deity vanquished, and yet the silence that followed was more profound than any victory cry. The air was still, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired, and for a moment, she felt as though the world had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. She could feel the curse that had bound her for so long unraveling, like chains falling away from her soul. The pain that had been her constant companion began to fade, leaving behind a strange emptiness. The curse was lifting, but it was not a moment of pure relief. Instead, it felt like the end of something vast and terrible, a darkness that had defined her life finally receding, leaving her standing on the precipice of something new and unknown. As the curse dissolved, she felt a warmth spreading through her, a gentle light that began to heal the scars it had left behind. But this light did not just heal her body, it reached deep into her soul, mending the wounds that had festered there for so long. With each passing moment, she could feel herself changing, her spirit transforming as the weight of the curse was lifted. But the lifting of the curse was not without consequences. The power that had held her in its grip was ancient and deep, and its release sent ripples through the world around her. The earth beneath her feet seemed to sigh, the trees shivered as if waking from a long, dark dream, and the wind carried whispers of the change that had taken place. The land that had suffered under the curse was beginning to heal, its scars slowly fading as new life began to stir. Yet, the cost of this change weighed heavily on her heart. She knew that her transformation was not simply a return to what she had been before. The curse had changed her in ways that could never be undone. She was no longer the innocent priestess who had once served the gods with pure devotion. The trials she had faced, the pain she had endured, had forged her into something different, something stronger. But with that strength came a deep sadness, a grief for the person she had lost along the way. As she stood there, gazing out at the world that was beginning to heal, she could feel the eyes of the gods upon her. They had watched her struggle, her triumph, and now they waited to see what she would do with the power that had been left in the wake of the curse. The gods were fickle, their favor fleeting, and she knew that her fate was still not entirely her own. Yet, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she had a choice. She could feel the remnants of the curse still lingering at the edges of her consciousness, like the last echoes of a nightmare. It would be so easy to let it go, to allow the light to fully heal her, to return to the life she had once known. But as she stood there, the memories of her journey, the people she had encountered, and the battles she had fought, all flooded back to her. She realized that the curse had not just been a burden, it had been a teacher, a force that had shaped her into who she was now. Calidora closed her eyes, breathing deeply as she made her decision. She would not return to what she had been. She would carry the lessons of the curse with her, letting it guide her as she stepped into the future. The light that had healed her would not erase her past, but it would illuminate the path ahead, allowing her to walk forward with a heart that was stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than before. The consequences of the curse, however, extended beyond just her. The land around her had been scarred by its dark power, and those scars would take time to heal. The people who had been affected by the curse, those who had suffered alongside her, who had been touched by its shadow, would need to find their own paths to healing. Some would rejoice in the lifting of the curse, their lives returning to what they had been before. But others, like Calidora, would be forever changed, their souls marked by the trials they had endured. As she turned to leave the temple, she felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead was uncertain, but she no longer feared it. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, the wrath of the gods, and the weight of a curse that had tried to destroy her. And yet, she had survived. More than that, she had emerged from the darkness with a new understanding of who she was and what she was capable of. The priestess who had once been defined by her devotion to the gods was gone, replaced by a woman who had found her strength not in the favor of divine beings, but in her own resilience, her own will to survive and to change. The curse had tried to break her, but in the end, it had only made her stronger. As she walked away from the temple, the first rays of sunlight touched her skin, warming her in a way she had not felt in a long time. The dawn was breaking, not just in the sky, but within her heart. And though the road ahead was long and filled with challenges yet to come, she knew that she would face it with the same courage and determination that had brought her through the darkness. The curse was gone, but its legacy would live on in her, a reminder of the trials she had faced and the strength she had found within herself. And as the world began to heal around her, Calidora took her first steps into a new life, one that she would shape with her own hands, guided by the wisdom she had gained from her journey through the shadows. The whispers of her tale began as soon as the first leaves fell from the ancient oak, the very tree that had stood witness to her struggle. In hushed tones, elders spoke of a priestess who had been both blessed and cursed by the gods. Her name, once uttered in reverence, now carried with it the weight of tragedy and triumph. She had been a beacon of faith, a symbol of unwavering devotion, yet her story would become a cautionary tale, woven into the very fabric of Greek mythology. Her life, marred by a curse that sought to break her, had instead forged a legacy that would endure long after her time on earth had ended. Children, gathered around their grandparents, would listen wide-eyed as the story of the Cursed Priestess was recounted. It was a story of a woman who, despite her suffering, had stood defiant against the will of gods and fate alike. She had been a symbol of strength, a reminder that even in the face of the darkest trials, the human spirit could prevail. The priestess had not set out to become a legend, nor had she wished for her pain to be immortalized. Yet, as the years passed, her story took on a life of its own. It was said that the land where she had once walked still bore the echoes of her presence, that the wind carried her voice, soft and mournful, as it whispered through the trees. Her tale was one of endurance, of a soul who refused to be broken, even when everything was taken from her. As her story spread, it became more than just a recounting of events. It became a lesson, a moral thread woven through the tapestry of myths that shaped the beliefs of the people. The priestess's tale was one of humility, a reminder of the power of the gods, and the dangers of pride. Yet, it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a story of redemption that offered hope to those who felt lost in their own struggles. The lessons learned from her life were passed down through the generations. They were spoken of in temples, where priests would remind the faithful that the favor of the gods was not to be taken lightly, that even those who served with the purest of hearts could find themselves at the mercy of divine whims. But there was also a deeper lesson, one that resonated more quietly in the hearts of those who heard her story, a lesson about the power of forgiveness, not just from the gods, but from oneself. The priestess had sought redemption, had journeyed through darkness in search of a way to lift the curse that had shattered her life. Her quest had not been just for her own sake, but for those who had suffered because of her. In the end, it was her willingness to face the truth, to accept the pain of her past, that had allowed her to break the chains that bound her. This, too, became a lesson for those who heard her tale, that true strength came not from denying one's flaws, but from embracing them and finding the courage to change. Her story became a beacon for those who struggled with their own burdens. It was said that when the night was at its darkest, when hope seemed lost, one could look to the stars and find solace in the knowledge that even the most cursed of souls could find peace. Her tale was told not just to frighten, but to inspire, to remind people that no matter how dire the circumstances, there was always a way forward, always a chance for redemption. Over time, the priestess's story became intertwined with other myths. Her name was spoken alongside those of heroes and gods, her trials compared to the labors of Hercules, her strength to that of Athena. Yet, despite the grandeur of the myths that surrounded her, her tale remained deeply human. It was a story that resonated not because of its epic scale, but because it spoke to the hearts of those who heard it. In the quiet moments, when the fire had burned low and the shadows danced on the walls, people would speak of her. They would recall how she had stood, alone and defiant, against forces that sought to destroy her. They would remember how she had not been defeated, even when the odds were stacked against her. And they would draw strength from her example, finding in her story a mirror of their own struggles, and a reminder that they, too, could endure. Her legacy was not just a tale of caution, but a story of hope. It was said that those who remembered her, who kept her story alive, would be blessed with the same strength that had carried her through her darkest days. And so, her name was passed down, generation after generation, her story growing and evolving, but always remaining true to the heart of the woman who had lived it. The Cursed Priestess became more than just a figure in a story. She became a symbol, a part of the collective memory of a people who had seen in her their own fears, their own hopes, and their own potential for greatness. Her story was told in times of trouble, when the darkness seemed too great to overcome, and it was remembered in times of peace, as a reminder of the strength that lay within the human spirit. And so, the legacy of the Cursed Priestess lived on, not just in the words of those who told her story, but in the hearts of those who heard it. Her tale became a part of the rich tapestry of Greek mythology, a story that would continue to be told for generations to come, a reminder that even in the face of the greatest trials, there was always a way forward, always a chance for redemption, and always the hope of finding peace.